Cop plants drugs on an innocent black woman, only to watch her pull out an FBI badge. His world shatters. He's framed a federal agent, and now the department wants her gone. He can stay silent or betray the corrupt system that made him, but either choice makes him a target. Now they're on the run, racing against time. How far will he go to undo his crime? And can she trust the man who tried to destroy her? Stay tuned. You won't believe how it ends. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun crawled through the broken blinds of Rick Daniels' apartment, casting striped shadows across empty beer bottles and yesterday's clothes. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through his throbbing headache like a knife. Rick sat on the edge of his unmade bed, pressing his fingers against his temples, trying to squeeze away the pain. "Shut up," he muttered, reaching over to silence the alarm. His hand brushed against his service pistol on the nightstand, cold steel a constant reminder of what he'd become. Next to it, his phone vibrated again, the screen lighting up with yet another missed call from Captain Monroe. 5 calls. Rick ran a hand through his disheveled hair and let out a heavy sigh. Monroe never called unless something was wrong, and 5 calls meant something was very wrong. The captain's persistence made Rick's stomach turn. He knew whatever was coming wouldn't be good. His apartment told the story of a man who'd stopped caring. Takeout containers littered the coffee table, and a leather jacket, once pristine, now worn and creased, hung limply over a kitchen chair. The morning light revealed dust dancing in the air, settling on surfaces long neglected. This one-bedroom apartment wasn't a home, it was just a place to crash between shifts. Rick forced himself to stand, his joints protesting every movement. He shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The mirror showed him what he didn't want to see: bloodshot eyes, stubble that was well past 5 o'clock shadow, and the deep lines of someone carrying too many secrets. By 7:15, Rick pushed through the heavy doors of District 17 Police Station. The precinct sat in the heart of Hamilton Heights, a predominantly black neighborhood that had seen better days. The familiar smell hit him as soon as he walked in: stale coffee, cigarette smoke that never quite cleared, and the sharp tang of cleaning supplies that failed to mask either. The locker room was already busy with the morning shift change. Officers moved around each other in a practiced dance, trading stories and complaints. Rick kept his head down, focusing on changing into his uniform. His fingers worked the buttons mechanically while conversations buzzed around him. "Hey, Daniels," Officer Peterson called out. "Rough night?" Rick grunted in response, not bothering to look up. He didn't need small talk. Not today. Not with Monroe's calls weighing on his mind. The briefing room was filling up when Rick walked in. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything look sickly and pale. He found a spot near the back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. The room smelled of too many bodies and not enough ventilation. Captain James Monroe stood at the front, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. His crisp uniform and perfectly maintained silver hair contrasted sharply with the worn-down appearance of the room. Monroe's face was set in granite, his eyes cold as they swept across the gathered officers. The murmuring continued until Monroe slammed a folder onto the podium. The sharp crack silenced the room instantly. Rick could feel the tension rise, could see officers straightening in their chairs. "We've got a problem, boys," Monroe announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. He opened the folder, though Rick knew he didn't need to read whatever was inside. This was theater, and Monroe was putting on a show. "Crime spiking in Hamilton Heights." Monroe's words came out like bullets. "The mayor's breathing down my neck. I want arrests, and I want them now." His eyes locked with various officers around the room. "I don't care who, just send a message." Rick felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard this speech before, seen this play out. When the brass wanted numbers, they got them. It didn't matter if they had to manufacture criminals to do it. Someone always paid the price, and it was never the ones giving the orders. Officers around him nodded, some taking notes, others already discussing potential targets in whispers. This was how it worked in District 17. No real investigation needed, no actual leads required. Just find someone who looked the part and make the charges stick. By 9 o'clock, Rick sat at his desk, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The morning briefing had set the machinery in motion. Already he could see teams gearing up, heading out to find today's unlucky suspects. Monroe's orders were being followed without question, without hesitation. Rick took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. Through the window of his captain's office, he could see Monroe on the phone, probably reassuring the mayor that action was being taken. The system worked like a well-oiled machine. Pressure from above, results from below, and truth caught somewhere in the middle. The coffee burned his throat as he watched younger officers eagerly planning their patrols, discussing which corners to hit, which usual suspects to round up. They still had that look, the one he'd lost years ago. The belief that they were doing the right thing, that this was justice. Rick couldn't remember when he'd stopped believing that himself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hamilton Heights as Rick Daniels walked his beat, his boots clicking against the cracked sidewalk. His eyes scanned the streets, taking in the usual scene: mothers hurrying their kids home from school, teenagers hanging out on stoops, old men playing chess in the park. But today, he was looking for something specific, someone to send a message. The local cafe caught his attention. Through its large windows, he watched the mix of people inside, students with laptops, workers on coffee breaks, and then her. A black woman in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit sat alone in the corner, radiating an air of confidence that seemed out of place in this neighborhood. She scrolled through her phone, occasionally sipping her coffee, completely at ease. Rick's jaw tightened. Something about her didn't sit right. Her posture was too straight, her clothes too expensive, her presence too deliberate. In his 20 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was telling him she didn't belong. He pushed open the cafe door, setting off the little bell above. The familiar smell of coffee and pastries filled his nostrils as he made his way to the counter. The teenage barista straightened up nervously at the sight of his uniform. "Just a regular coffee, Black," Rick said, keeping his voice casual while his eyes stayed fixed on the woman in his peripheral vision. She hadn't even glanced up at his entrance. As he waited for his coffee, he studied her reflection in the glass display case. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place. A leather briefcase sat beside her chair, probably worth more than his monthly rent. Everything about her screamed corporate professional, but something felt off. The barista handed him his coffee with slightly trembling hands. Rick gave her a practiced smile, dropped $1 in the tip jar, and positioned himself near the condiment station. He pulled out a small packet of sugar, taking his time to stir it into his coffee while watching the woman. She finished her drink and began gathering her things, sliding her phone into her blazer pocket. Rick's hand instinctively touched the small bag in his own pocket. His insurance policy, used countless times before. The cocaine was already measured out just enough to constitute possession with intent to distribute. As she stood up, Rick timed his movement perfectly. He turned away from the condiment station just as she walked past, bumping into her with practiced precision. His hand slipped into her blazer pocket, depositing the bag so smoothly that even someone watching closely would have missed it. "Oh, excuse me," he said, steadying his coffee cup as if concerned about spilling it. She gave him a polite nod, but before she could walk away, he cleared his throat. "Ma'am, hold on a second." She turned back, one eyebrow slightly raised. The cafe had grown quieter, other customers watching the scene unfold. "We got a complaint," Rick said, his voice shifting to its authoritative tone. "Would you mind if I checked your pockets?" Her eyes met his, dark and unreadable. For a moment he expected resistance, but she simply shrugged. "Go ahead, officer." The casual confidence in her voice made his skin prickle. Most people showed at least a hint of nervousness when a cop asked to search them, even when they had nothing to hide. But she just stood there, completely unfazed. Rick reached into her blazer pocket, making a show of the discovery. He pulled out the small bag, holding it up to the light. Gasps echoed through the cafe, customers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Well, what do we have here?" Rick's voice carried across the now silent cafe. He expected to see fear flash across her face, maybe anger or desperation. Instead, her expression remained eerily calm, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Turn around, ma'am," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." She complied without protest, placing her hands behind her back. The metal cuffs clicked into place around her wrists, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cafe. Rick recited the Miranda rights, his words mechanical and practiced. As he turned her to face him, their eyes met again. There was something in her gaze that made him pause. Not fear, not anger, not even resignation. It was something else, something he couldn't quite read, and it sent an unexpected chill down his spine. She stood there in handcuffs, her expensive suit wrinkled where the cuffs pulled at her blazer, but somehow she didn't look diminished. If anything, she seemed to stand taller, her composure unshaken. The other customers averted their eyes, but she kept hers locked on Rick's face, as if memorizing every detail. Rick felt a bead of sweat roll down his back despite the cafe's air conditioning. He'd done this dozens of times before, planting evidence, making arrests to fill quotas, sending messages to keep the bosses happy. It was just part of the job, part of how things worked in this broken system. But something about this woman's steady gaze made his practiced confidence waver. Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she protesting her innocence or begging for mercy like all the others? The weight of her silence pressed against him, making the familiar routine feel suddenly foreign and wrong. He tightened his grip on her arm, leading her toward the door. The other customers parted like water, their faces a mixture of shock and practiced indifference. But she moved with the same calm confidence she'd shown while sitting at her table, as if being arrested was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her day. The afternoon sun hit them as they stepped outside, but Rick barely noticed the warmth. All he could focus on was the woman beside him and the growing unease in his gut. Something wasn't right here. Something was very wrong indeed. The fluorescent lights of District 17's booking area hummed overhead as Rick guided Tasha through the familiar process. His hand rested casually on his belt, maintaining the appearance of routine procedure. The booking desk's scratched surface held the usual forms: arrest reports, processing documents, all the paperwork that turned people into numbers. "Stand here," Rick commanded, gesturing to the worn yellow line on the floor. His voice carried the practiced authority of countless arrests. Tasha complied without protest, her posture relaxed despite the handcuffs. The booking area was empty, except for a junior officer organizing files in the corner, the sound of shuffling papers mixing with the quiet hum of computers. Rick picked up a pen, ready to start the booking forms. "Name?" he asked, though he'd already decided to run her for priors. "Tasha Owens." Her voice was steady, almost amused. No tremor, no fear, just that same unnerving calm she'd shown at the cafe. Rick's pen scratched against the paper as he filled in the basic information. The cocaine bag sat in an evidence envelope beside him, tagged and logged. It was all by the book, exactly like the hundreds of other arrests he'd processed over the years. Date of birth? "You might want to hold off on those forms, Officer Daniels." Tasha's words carried a weight that made Rick's hand pause mid-writing. She moved deliberately, reaching into her back pocket with her cuffed hands. Rick tensed, but she simply withdrew a leather wallet. With precise movements, she placed it on the desk and nudged it toward him. The leather fell open, revealing a gleaming FBI badge and identification card. The pen slipped from Rick's fingers, clattering against the desk. His throat went dry as he stared at the federal credentials. Each detail of the badge seemed to mock him: the eagle emblem, the Department of Justice seal, the credentials identifying Tasha Owens as a special agent. "Take a good look at that evidence, Officer Daniels," Tasha said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Because in about 5 minutes, it'll be Exhibit A in your corruption case." Rick's world tilted sideways. The booking area suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. The junior officer in the corner continued filing, oblivious to the bomb that had just been dropped. Without a word, Rick grabbed Tasha's arm and steered her toward the hallway. His mind raced through options, each worse than the last. There was only one place to go, one person who needed to know immediately. The walk to Captain Monroe's office felt like a death march. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, marking time until his career imploded. Rick knocked on the heavy wooden door, his knuckles white against the dark grain. "Come in," Monroe's voice boomed from inside. Rick pushed the door open, ushering Tasha inside. Monroe sat behind his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed reports. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Daniels?" Monroe asked, then noticed Tasha's handcuffs. "Ah, the drug arrest. Good work today." "Sir," Rick's voice cracked, "we have a situation." Monroe removed his glasses, his expression darkening. "Explain." "She's FBI." The words fell like lead between them. The change in Monroe was instant. His face flushed red as he surged to his feet, both fists slamming against his desk with enough force to make his nameplate jump. "You framed an FBI agent?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Rick's stomach dropped as the full weight of his actions crashed down. All those whispers about federal investigations, the rumors of undercover agents, they hadn't been rumors at all. Monroe's eyes darted between Rick and Tasha, calculating. His jaw clenched as he worked through the implications. The precinct's carefully maintained system of quotas and convenient arrests suddenly seemed very fragile. "Remove those cuffs," Monroe ordered, his voice tight with controlled rage. Rick fumbled with the key, his usually steady hands betraying his nerves. The handcuffs clicked open, and Tasha rubbed her wrists, though they both knew she hadn't been bound tight enough to leave marks. "Special Agent Owens," Monroe said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure we can work something out. This was clearly a misunderstanding." "Was it?" Tasha's question carried the weight of months of investigation. "Like the misunderstanding with Marcus Thompson last month? Or maybe like James Wilson's arrest in February?" Monroe's fake smile vanished. His eyes took on a dangerous glint as he stared at the FBI agent who threatened everything he'd built. The office felt smaller, the air heavier with unspoken threats. "Officer Daniels," Monroe's voice was ice. "Wait outside." Rick hesitated, looking between his captain and the FBI agent. Something in Monroe's tone set off warning bells, but he couldn't refuse a direct order. He stepped toward the door. "She's a problem," Monroe said, his words stopping Rick in his tracks. "And I don't need problems." Rick stood frozen in the doorway, the implications of Monroe's words clear as day. His career, his freedom, his entire life balanced on what happened in the next few moments. The choice between following orders and doing what's right had never been more stark or more dangerous. The harsh overhead lights cast deep shadows across Captain Monroe's face as he leaned forward in his leather chair. His cold eyes locked onto Rick's, unwavering and determined. "She's a loose end. Take care of it." The words hung in the stale office air like a death sentence. Rick's throat went dry. His palms grew sweaty against his uniform pants as the full weight of the order settled in his gut. He'd done plenty of dirty work before, planting evidence, falsifying reports, looking the other way. But murder? That was different. That was a line he'd never crossed. Monroe's voice dropped lower, almost gentle, like a father giving advice. "This isn't a request, Daniels. We've got too much at stake. One FBI agent with a grudge could bring down everything we've built." He pulled out a manila folder from his desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface. "Your signature is on hundreds of reports just like this one. Reports that wouldn't hold up under federal scrutiny." Rick's hands felt numb as he picked up the folder. Inside were copies of arrest reports he'd filed over the years, each one doctored, each one a lie he'd told to keep the machine running smoothly. His whole career, laid out in black and white, was nothing but a stack of false charges and ruined lives. "I understand, sir," Rick managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe nodded, satisfied. "Good. Make it clean. Make it look like she hung herself in her cell. Happens all the time with these types." Rick left the office, his footsteps echoing through the nearly empty precinct. The night shift was sparse, just a skeleton crew of officers who knew better than to ask questions. The holding cell area smelled of disinfectant and despair. Tasha sat on the metal bench in her cell, her posture still perfect despite the circumstances. She didn't look afraid. If anything, she looked prepared, like she'd been expecting this moment. Her eyes met Rick's through the bars, and he saw something there that made him pause. Not defeat, but determination. "Officer Daniels." Her voice was steady, professional. "I assume Captain Monroe has given his orders?" Before Rick could respond, heavy footsteps approached from behind. Officer Tyler Sloan's thick frame filled the corridor, his face split by a predatory grin. Well, our little FBI friend getting comfortable? Sloan was Monroe's favorite enforcer, a man who treated violence like an art form. He'd been with the department for 15 years, and rumors of his brutality were legendary among the street cops. "Just checking on our guest," Rick said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Sloan moved closer, his shoulder brushing against Rick's. His breath smelled of cigarettes and coffee as he leaned in to whisper, "She won't make it to sunrise." The words carried a hint of anticipation that made Rick's stomach turn. "Monroe wants us both on this, can't have any loose ends, right?" Rick nodded mechanically, his mind racing. He'd seen Sloan's handiwork before, suspects who resisted arrest, witnesses who accidentally fell downstairs. The man enjoyed his work too much, took too much pleasure in dealing out pain. Tasha watched their exchange without comment, her eyes moving between the two officers. She didn't plead or protest. Instead, she sat there like she was conducting an interview, studying their every move. "I'll take first watch," Sloan said, patting Rick's shoulder. "You go get some air. Come back around 11 and we'll finish this up." His tone made it clear. This wasn't a suggestion. Rick walked away, his footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. Each step felt like lead as he made his way to his office, a small room cluttered with case files and coffee cups. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. 8:45 p.m. In just a few hours, Tasha would be dead, and he would be complicit in murder. He sat at his desk, staring at the wall where his commendations hung in cheap frames. 15 years of service, each certificate a reminder of how far he'd strayed from the oath he'd taken to protect and serve. The young idealist who'd graduated from the academy would never have imagined ending up here, plotting an execution in a holding cell. If he did nothing, Tasha would be dead by morning. Sloan would make it look like suicide, and Monroe would make sure the paperwork disappeared. Another statistic, another tragedy that no one would question too closely. But if he helped her, everything would crumble. His career, his freedom, his whole life, gone in an instant. Monroe's files contained enough evidence to send him to prison for decades, and that was if he survived long enough to see trial. Men like Monroe and Sloan didn't leave loose ends. The clock continued its relentless march toward midnight. Rick sat motionless, the weight of his service weapon suddenly heavy against his hip. In his mind, he saw all the faces of people he'd wronged over the years, suspects he'd framed, witnesses he'd intimidated, lives he'd ruined to keep Monroe's machine running smoothly. Now, sitting alone in his office as midnight approached, Rick Daniels faced the biggest decision of his life. The right choice would destroy him. The wrong choice would destroy whatever was left of his soul. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the holding area, casting harsh shadows through the metal bars. Tasha Owens sat perfectly still on the thin mattress, her navy suit wrinkled but her dignity intact. Her dark eyes tracked every movement beyond her cell, cataloging faces, memorizing details. She'd been in worse situations during her years of undercover work, but this time felt different. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of what was coming. Officer Tyler Sloan leaned against the wall outside her cell, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming under the artificial light. His arms were crossed over his chest, and a cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. He'd been watching her for the past hour, clearly enjoying what he thought were her final moments. "FBI, huh?" Sloan's voice dripped with mockery. "Fancy title won't mean much when you're 6 feet under." He pushed off from the wall and approached the bars, his fingers drumming against the metal. "You know, I've seen plenty of suspects hang themselves in these cells. Tragic, really. The guilt just gets to them." Tasha didn't flinch. She'd studied men like Sloan throughout her career, bullies with badges who thought power meant strength. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any response could have. "Nothing to say," Sloan taunted, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the cell bars. "No clever FBI comebacks?" Tasha finally met his gaze, her expression neutral. "I'm not in the habit of having conversations with soon-to-be defendants." Sloan's face reddened, but before he could respond, another officer called him from down the hall. He shot Tasha one last threatening look before walking away, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. In his office, Rick Daniels sat at his desk, the wood worn smooth from years of similar late-night contemplations. His fingers tapped an irregular rhythm as his mind raced through scenarios. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the clock on the wall, each tick bringing them closer to what felt inevitable. He knew the playbook by heart. He'd seen it happen before, though he'd always managed to keep his hands clean of the worst of it. Someone would come in during the night shift. There would be a struggle. Maybe she'd grab for an officer's gun. Or maybe they'd keep it simple. A bedsheet fashioned into a noose, a tragic suicide note found too late. His hand moved to his keys, the metal warm from his constant fidgeting. The evidence locker key felt particularly heavy among the others. In his mind, he could see the sequence of events that would follow any choice he made with perfect clarity. If he did nothing, Tasha Owens would be dead before sunrise. Another statistic, another tragedy that would be quietly buried under paperwork and procedure. Monroe would make sure everything looked clean. The department would move on and Rick would carry another weight in his conscience. But if he acted, if he helped her, everything he'd built over the past 15 years would crumble. His pension, his reputation, his friendships, all of it would vanish. He'd be marked as a traitor, and in law enforcement there was no coming back from that. Rick pushed back from his desk, the chair's wheels squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat as he stood up. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting his shadow long across the office floor. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, shrugging it on with movements that felt mechanical. His service weapon sat heavy on his hip, a constant reminder of the oath he'd taken years ago, an oath that had somehow led him here to this moment. The walk to the evidence locker seemed longer than usual. Each step echoed in the nearly empty precinct, and every shadow made him tense. A few night shift officers nodded to him as he passed, but none questioned his presence. He was a familiar face, trusted, one of their own. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now he stood outside the evidence locker, his key hovering near the lock. Through the small window in the door, he could see the shelves of tagged items, drugs, weapons, stacks of files. Somewhere in there was the planted cocaine that had started all of this, along with countless other pieces of evidence that could unravel years of corruption. His hand trembled slightly as he held the key. If he opened this door, there would be no going back. Everything he'd been part of, every compromised case, every falsified report, it would all come crashing down. And yet the alternative was becoming an accomplice to murder. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the look in Tasha's eyes when she'd revealed her FBI badge. There hadn't been fear there, or even anger. Just determination. She'd known the risks when she'd gone undercover, just as she probably knew the danger she was in now. The key felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as he held it there, suspended between action and inaction, between the person he'd become and the officer he'd once wanted to be. Rick's office felt like a pressure cooker at 2:15 a.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his cluttered desk. His hands were sweaty as he grabbed Tasha's arm, probably harder than necessary, and pulled her inside. The door slammed behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the empty precinct. "You have exactly 1 minute to convince me this is worth blowing up my entire life for," Rick growled, his voice low and rough. He couldn't keep the tremor of uncertainty out of his words. Tasha settled into the chair across from his desk, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Despite being in custody for hours, she looked completely unfazed. Her navy suit was wrinkled, but her eyes were sharp and clear as she studied him. "You already know it is," she said simply. "Otherwise, I'd be dead already." Rick ran his hands through his hair, messing it up even more than usual. She was right, and that knowledge burned in his gut like acid. He'd spent years looking the other way, following orders, playing the game. But ordering a hit on an FBI agent? That crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered, pacing behind his desk. "These people, they're not just dirty cops, they're dangerous." "And you've been helping them," Tasha said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "How many others have you framed, Rick? How many lives have you ruined because Monroe told you to?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair, knuckles turning white. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. 2:25 a.m. They were running out of time. "Come on," he said finally, pulling out his keys. "We need to move, now." The security hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet at 2:30 a.m. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as Rick led the way, checking around each corner before proceeding. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. The key scraped in the lock as he removed Tasha's handcuffs. She rubbed her wrists, watching him carefully. "If you're doing this for me, stop," she said suddenly, grabbing his arm. Her grip was firm but not threatening. "Do it for yourself. You know this department is rotten." Rick stared at her hand on his arm, unable to meet her eyes. The truth of her words hung heavy in the air between them. Every arrest quota, every planted evidence, every accident in custody, it all crashed down on him at once. He opened his mouth to respond, but movement at the end of the hallway caught his eye. A shadow passed across the wall. Someone was coming. They pressed themselves against the wall, barely breathing. Rick's hand instinctively went to his service weapon. The footsteps grew closer, then faded as they turned down another corridor. "We need to keep moving," Rick whispered, his voice barely audible. They crept through the building like ghosts, using every trick Rick had learned in his years on the force. Each creaking floor tile made him wince. Every distant sound could be Sloan, or one of Monroe's other attack dogs coming to finish what Rick had started. The back door was their best shot. It led to an alley where the security cameras had been malfunctioning for months. The same blind spot they used when they needed certain evidence to disappear. Rick's hands were shaking slightly as he inserted the key into the lock at 3 a.m. The door opened with a soft click, revealing the dark alley beyond. "Took you long enough," Tasha muttered as they stepped into the night. The cool air hit them like a wave as they slipped into the darkness, leaving behind everything Rick had known and everything he'd helped cover up for the past 15 years. The streets of Hamilton Heights were eerily quiet at 3:30 a.m. Rick and Tasha moved like shadows between buildings, their footsteps echoing off brick walls. Every distant siren made them freeze, hearts pounding. The familiar streets where Rick had patrolled for years now felt like a maze of danger. "Down here," Rick whispered, pulling Tasha into a narrow alley as a patrol car's headlights swept past. The blue and red lights painted the wet pavement in shifting colors. They pressed themselves against the cold brick wall, barely breathing until the car passed. Tasha's eyes scanned their surroundings with practiced precision. "They'll have officers at every major intersection," she said softly. "We need to stay in the shadows." Rick nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool night air. "There's a lot of unmarked cars parked behind Murphy's bar, 3 blocks east." His voice was rough with tension. "If we can get there without being spotted." They moved carefully through the back alleys, ducking behind dumpsters whenever headlights appeared. The sound of radio chatter drifted through the night air, making them pause repeatedly. Rick's police training had taught him how to move quietly, but now he was using those skills to evade his own colleagues. Another patrol car rolled past the alley entrance. Tasha grabbed Rick's arm, pulling him behind a stack of wooden pallets. They crouched there, shoulders touching, barely breathing. The car stopped at the intersection, its spotlight sweeping the area. "They're setting up a perimeter," Rick muttered. "We need to move faster." When the coast was clear, they sprinted across the street to another alley. Their footsteps splashed through puddles, the sound seeming too loud in the quiet night. Rick's heart was hammering against his ribs. Every shadow could be hiding another officer. Every corner could lead them straight into a trap. Finally, they reached Murphy's bar. The parking lot behind it was dark and quiet, several unmarked police vehicles sitting in neat rows. Rick approached one of them cautiously, checking for any signs of movement in the surrounding windows. "Keep watch," he whispered to Tasha, who positioned herself at the corner of the building, her eyes alert. Rick worked quickly, using his years of experience to hotwire the car. His hands shook slightly as he connected the wires. The engine caught with a soft purr, and he gestured for Tasha to get in. They pulled out of the lot slowly, Rick keeping the headlights off until they reached the main street. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as they merged onto the highway at 4 a.m. The city lights stretched out before them, a maze of golden dots against the dark sky. Tasha sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the side mirror, watching for any signs of pursuit. The stolen police car hummed smoothly beneath them as Rick accelerated, trying to maintain a speed that wouldn't draw attention. "You just became a fugitive, Daniels," Tasha said, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to her words that made Rick's stomach tighten. Rick's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You too," he replied, watching the road ahead. The reality of what they'd done was starting to sink in. His entire life, his career, his reputation, everything he'd built, was now in ruins. There was no going back from this. The highway stretched out before them, empty except for the occasional truck. Every set of headlights in their rearview mirror made Rick's heart skip a beat. They passed exit signs and mile markers, putting distance between themselves and the city that had been Rick's home for his entire life. At 5 a.m., the car's police radio crackled to life. Rick turned up the volume slightly, and they both listened as the dispatcher's voice filled the car. "All units be advised. APB for FBI agent Tasha Owens and Officer Rick Daniels. Suspects are considered armed and dangerous. Last seen in Hamilton Heights area. All available units respond." Tasha and Rick exchanged a glance in the dim light of the dashboard. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air between them. "Well," Tasha sighed, her voice steady despite everything. "Now it's official." They drove on into the unknown, the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The stolen police car carried them forward, while behind them, the city they'd left behind was waking up to the news of their betrayal. Every officer they'd ever worked with would now be looking for them, every patrol car a potential threat. The radio continued to crackle with updates and coordinates, each message a reminder of the massive manhunt that was now underway. Rick reached over and turned it off, leaving them in silence except for the steady hum of the engine. The highway stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of asphalt leading away from everything they'd known. Streetlights flashed past like shooting stars, each one marking another moment of their escape into uncertainty. The cheap motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and old carpet. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting a sickly yellow glow across the dated wallpaper. Rick sat on the edge of the squeaky bed, his shoulders tense as he watched the morning news. Beside him, Tasha perched in a worn armchair, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Breaking news this morning," the anchor's voice filled the small room. "A massive manhunt is underway for FBI agent Tasha Owens and police officer Rick Daniels. Both suspects are considered armed and dangerous." Their mugshots flashed across the screen. Rick barely recognized himself. The photo they used made him look like a hardened criminal. Next to his picture, Tasha's professional FBI headshot seemed bizarrely out of place. "Sources say Officer Daniels aided in Agent Owens' escape from police custody late last night," the anchor continued. "Captain James Monroe of the 17th Precinct had this to say." The screen cut to Monroe standing at a podium, his face grave. "This is a betrayal of the highest order. Officer Daniels has not only aided a dangerous criminal, but has turned his back on his brothers in blue. We will not rest until both suspects are brought to justice." Rick's stomach churned. "Dangerous criminal," he muttered, shaking his head. "They're painting you as some kind of mastermind who corrupted me." Tasha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course they are. It's easier to sell that story than admit they tried to murder a federal agent." The news switched to live helicopter footage of police units spreading across the city. Roadblocks were being set up at major intersections. Their faces appeared again, this time with a hotline number below. If anyone has information about the whereabouts of these suspects, please contact law enforcement immediately. Do not attempt to approach. Rick rubbed his tired eyes. They hadn't slept more than an hour or two since their escape. The adrenaline that had kept them going was wearing off, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and the heavy weight of reality. They're throwing everything they have at us, Tasha observed, her voice steady despite the situation. Monroe must be desperate. He should be, Rick replied. If word gets out that he ordered a hit on an FBI agent, it's not just about me anymore, Tasha cut in. Think about it. Why would they risk this much exposure? There has to be something bigger they're trying to hide. Rick stood up and paced the small room, his boots wearing a path in the thin carpet. The TV continued its coverage, showing more officers joining the search, more roadblocks going up. Their faces appeared again and again like a recurring nightmare. At 8 o'clock, Rick grabbed the remote and clicked off the TV. The sudden silence felt heavy, oppressive. He turned to Tasha, his expression grim. We need a plan. Tasha leaned forward in her chair, her eyes intense. We're not running. What? You heard me. We're not running. We're taking them down. Her voice was steel, leaving no room for argument. Rick stared at her, then let out a harsh laugh. Take them down? Did you miss the part where every cop in the city is looking for us? That's exactly why we have to do this, Tasha said. Think about it, Rick. They're not just trying to silence me anymore. They're willing to throw away your career, your life, just to keep whatever they're hiding under wraps. She stood up and walked to the window, carefully peering through the curtains at the empty parking lot below. Monroe, the corrupt officers, the whole system, they only have power because people like you and me let them get away with it. Rick felt the truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. How many times had he looked the other way? How many routine arrests had he made, knowing they were bogus? How many lives had he helped destroy just because it was easier than doing the right thing? I've got evidence, Tasha continued. Files, recordings, documentation of every dirty deal and false arrest in the 17th precinct for the past year. But I need more. I need someone on the inside to verify it all. She turned to face him. I need you, Rick. Rick sank back onto the bed, his mind racing. Everything he'd built his life around, his badge, his position, his relationships with fellow officers, it was all gone now. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something better from the ashes. Monroe will have destroyed anything incriminating at the station, he said slowly. A small smile crossed Tasha's face. No, he won't. Because he doesn't know what I was really after. At 9 o'clock, Tasha pulled out her laptop, a special FBI-issued model she'd managed to keep hidden during her arrest. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the soft clicking filling the quiet room. Rick watched her work, amazed at her focus and determination. This woman he'd tried to frame just yesterday was now his only ally in a fight that seemed impossible to win. What are you doing? He asked, moving closer to see the screen. Accessing encrypted files, she replied, not looking up. Everything I gathered is stored on secure servers. Monroe and his cronies can't touch it. She paused, then added, We're exposing them, Rick. All of them. Rick watched the data scroll across her screen, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt surprisingly like hope. The ancient TV buzzed with static as Rick flipped through channels, each one showing the same story. His stomach churned as he watched their faces flash across the screen again and again. The motel room felt smaller with each passing minute, the worn carpet and peeling wallpaper closing in around them. Breaking news update on the manhunt for rogue FBI agent Tasha Owens and disgraced officer Rick Daniels, a reporter's voice crackled through the old speaker. Police warn that both suspects should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. Rick clicked to another channel. Same story, different anchor. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his bones. The cheap mattress creaked under him as he shifted his weight. Behind him, the rapid clicking of keyboard keys filled the silence. Tasha sat hunched over her laptop at the small desk, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Her suit jacket was draped over the chair, her sleeves rolled up as she worked. She hadn't stopped typing since they'd checked in. "We don't have much time," she said without looking up, her fingers never missing a beat. "They'll start sweeping motels soon." Rick let out a bitter laugh, switching off the TV. "And what's your grand plan?" He turned to face her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just walk into the FBI and tell them, 'Hey, I was framed by my own department, but it's cool now.'" The typing stopped. Tasha slowly looked up from her screen, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I don't trust you," she said plainly. "And you don't trust me. But right now we need each other, so quit the sarcasm and listen." Rick stood up, his boots scuffing against the carpet as he began to pace. The room was too small for his restless energy. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the thin curtains, creating strips of light that cut across the floor. Each time he passed through one, it felt like a spotlight following his movements. "You still haven't told me why you were undercover in the first place," he said, stopping to lean against the wall. The wallpaper was sticky against his back, years of cigarette smoke having left their mark. Tasha leaned back in her chair, which groaned under the shift in weight. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Because your department isn't just dirty," she said slowly, measuring each word. "It's rotten to the core." She told him everything then. About the deep corruption ring she'd been investigating for months. About high-ranking officers working with organized crime bosses, laundering drug money through legitimate businesses across the city. The web of corruption stretched far beyond anything Rick had imagined, reaching into City Hall, the courts, even federal offices. "I had evidence linking Captain Monroe to at least 3 shell companies," she continued, her voice tight with frustration. "Bank records showing suspicious transfers, witness statements about police escorts for drug shipments. I was so close." She fixed him with a hard stare. "I had one shot at this, and you nearly destroyed it." Rick's throat felt dry. All those times Monroe had ordered arrests without cause, all those quotas that needed filling, they weren't just about statistics. They were distractions, smoke screens to hide something much bigger. And he'd been part of it whether he'd known it or not. The weight of what he'd done hit him all at once. By trying to frame Tasha, he hadn't just attempted to ruin one person's life. He'd nearly derailed an investigation that could have exposed years of systematic corruption. The realization left him speechless. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and regrets. Outside, a car door slammed, making them both tense. But it was just another motel guest. Tasha turned back to her laptop, her posture rigid. "I have a contact in the FBI who might help," she said, closing the computer with a decisive click. "But we need proof first." Rick exhaled sharply, pushing himself off the wall. "Then let's get it." The abandoned garage smelled of old motor oil and rust. Shafts of late morning sunlight pierced through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Rick moved between these shadows, checking entrances and peering through gaps in the boards covering the windows. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. This place had been his secret spot for years, where he'd made deals, traded favors, and looked the other way when money changed hands. Now it was their temporary sanctuary. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tasha sat cross-legged on an old workbench, her laptop balanced on her knees. The blue glow of the screen reflected in her focused eyes as her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision. She'd been working for 20 minutes straight, barely breathing. "How much longer?" Rick asked, his voice tight with tension. He didn't like staying in one place too long. "Almost there," Tasha muttered, not looking up. "Their security is good, but not good enough." Rick continued his patrol, his hand never far from his service weapon. Every distant car sound made him tense. The garage was safer than the motel. No cameras, no nosy desk clerks, multiple escape routes. But it still felt exposed. The space around them was filled with abandoned tools and half-dismantled cars, their shells collecting dust like mechanical fossils. Rick remembered bringing suspects here, away from prying eyes. How many times had he crossed lines in this very room? How many lives had he ruined? "I'm in," Tasha announced suddenly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Her typing speed increased, and Rick could see strings of code reflecting in her glasses. "Their internal network is mine now." Rick moved closer, watching over her shoulder as she navigated through folders and files. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything unusual? Financial records, arrest reports, internal memos?" She trailed off as something caught her eye. "Wait, what's this?" Rick leaned in closer as she opened an encrypted folder. Inside were spreadsheets, dozens of them. As Tasha scrolled through the data, Rick felt his blood run cold. "These are arrest records," Tasha said slowly, her voice hardening. "But look at these notations, payment amounts, contact names, dates." She turned to face him, her expression grim. "Your department has been selling arrests, framing people for cash payouts." Rick's stomach twisted as he saw his own name appear multiple times in the files. Each entry represented someone he'd arrested, someone he'd framed, but he'd never known about the payments. He'd just been following orders, doing what was expected. "I was just a pawn," he muttered, more to himself than to Tasha. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All those times Monroe had given specific targets, all those arrests that seemed too convenient. It hadn't just been about quotas or statistics, it had been about money. Tasha's fingers flew across the keyboard again. "I'm sending this to someone I trust, a journalist who's been investigating police corruption. Once this goes public, there's no turning back." Rick watched as she worked, feeling numb. Everything he'd believed about his job, his department, his role in the system, it was all built on lies. He'd known things were corrupt, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Within minutes, Tasha's contact had received the files and begun posting them online. Social media exploded with screenshots and excerpts. The truth was spreading like wildfire, and there was nothing Monroe or anyone else could do to stop it. Rick's phone buzzed in his pocket, displaying an unknown number. His hand trembled slightly as he answered it. "What the hell did you do?" Monroe's voice was deadly quiet, barely containing his rage. The garage fell silent after Rick ended the call. His hand was still gripping the phone, knuckles white. Monroe's voice had been eerily calm, the kind of calm that preceded violence. Rick had heard that tone before, usually right before someone disappeared. Tasha was already in motion, her laptop sliding into her bag with practiced efficiency. Her movements were quick but controlled, leaving no trace of their presence. "We need to move. The second they trace that data, they'll be coming for us." Rick checked his service weapon, making sure it was loaded. The familiar weight offered little comfort now. "I know a guy who might help," he said, watching Tasha gather their evidence. "But if we go to him, there's no turning back." "We passed no turning back when you helped me escape," Tasha replied, zipping up her bag. She paused, studying his face. "Can you trust this person?" Rick thought about Paul Grayson. They'd started at the academy together, shared patrol cars, watched each other's backs. But that was before Monroe's influence had poisoned everything, before the department had become a playground for corruption. They hadn't spoken properly in years. "He used to be my friend," Rick said finally, "and last I checked he was still clean. Kept his distance from Monroe's schemes." Tasha shouldered her bag, her expression skeptical. "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's all we've got." They left through the back of the garage, staying in the shadows of industrial buildings. The city felt different now. Every passing car a potential threat, every pedestrian a possible informant. Rick led them through a maze of side streets and alleyways, avoiding main roads and security cameras. The warehouse district near the docks was practically deserted at this hour. Most of the buildings stood empty, their windows dark and uninviting. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel hung heavy in the air. Rick had texted Grayson from a burner phone. "Need help, Dock 17. Important." The response had come quickly. 1:30, come alone. They arrived early, scanning the area for any signs of a setup. The warehouse was a hulking structure of corroded metal and crumbling concrete. Perfect sight lines in every direction, multiple exits. If things went bad, they'd have options. "Stay hidden," Rick told Tasha. if this goes south. "I've got your back," she said simply, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby loading bay. At exactly 1:30, footsteps echoed through the empty warehouse. Paul Grayson emerged from the darkness, looking older than Rick remembered. His detective's badge gleamed dully on his belt. "Jesus, Rick," Grayson said, shaking his head. "What the hell have you done?" "What I should have done years ago," Rick replied, watching his old friend carefully. "The department's rotten, Paul. You know it. We've got proof now. Real proof." Grayson ran a hand through his graying hair. "Monroe's going nuclear. The whole force is looking for you." "I know you're still clean," Rick said, taking a step forward. "We need help. Someone who can get this evidence to the right people." Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I might know someone who can get you out of this mess." The words were right, but something in Grayson's tone made Rick's skin crawl. He'd heard that tone before, in his own voice, when he was setting someone up. Before Rick could react, the warehouse erupted in light and sound. Flashlights pierced the darkness from every direction. The metallic click of weapons being readied echoed off the walls. "Drop your weapon!" Multiple voices shouted at once. Rick dove behind a concrete pillar as the first shots rang out. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of Grayson backing away, his expression a mixture of guilt and relief. "Sorry, Rick," Grayson called out, "but Monroe owns this city. You should have known better." A bullet sparked off the pillar near Rick's head. He returned fire, not aiming to hit anyone, just trying to keep them back. Where was Tasha? His question was answered by gunfire from the loading bay. Tasha had positioned herself perfectly, catching their attackers in a crossfire. The surprise gave them the opening they needed. "Rick, move!" Tasha's voice cut through the gunfire. Rick sprinted between pillars, bullets tracking his movement. He could hear shouting, calls for backup, the sound of boots on concrete. But Tasha had created enough confusion to give them a chance. They met at the back exit, covering each other as they burst through the door into the afternoon sun. The sound of sirens filled the air. More units were coming. But they had a head start, and they knew these streets. Rick spared one last glance at the warehouse as they ran. Another friendship destroyed, another bridge burned. But there was no time for regret. They were running for their lives, and the whole city was hunting them. The alley stank of rotting garbage and stale cooking oil. Rick and Tasha crouched behind a rusty dumpster, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, offering some cover from prying eyes. Their clothes were dirty and torn from diving through the warehouse window during their escape. Rick peered around the dumpster's edge, watching a police cruiser roll past the alley's entrance. His shoulder ached where he'd hit the ground running. Once the cruiser disappeared, he slumped back against the grimy wall. "We're officially out of friends," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. The betrayal still stung. Grayson had been his partner years ago, before the corruption had taken root. Now he was just another cop on Monroe's payroll. Tasha checked her laptop bag, making sure nothing had been damaged in their escape. Her usually pristine suit was smudged with dirt, and there was a small cut above her eyebrow, but her eyes remained sharp and focused. "Friends were always a luxury in this line of work," she replied, though Rick caught a hint of disappointment in her voice. "We need to keep moving. They'll have every cop in the city looking for us now." They made their way through back alleys and side streets, avoiding main roads where cameras might spot them. Rick's police training helped them dodge patrol routes, while Tasha's FBI experience kept them from leaving traces. They worked together without speaking, two professionals who'd found themselves on the same side of a war they never expected to fight. After an hour of careful navigation, they found themselves at the back entrance of an old bookstore. The windows were covered in yellowed newspaper, and a "closed for renovation" sign hung crookedly on the door. Rick picked the lock while Tasha kept watch. The basement smelled of mold and old paper. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light filtering through the dirty windows near the ceiling. Boxes of unsold books created a maze of shadows around them. Tasha pulled out a burner phone from her bag. Her fingers hesitated over the keypad for just a moment, long enough for Rick to notice. This was her last play, and they both knew it. She dialed the number from memory. The phone rang 3 times before a male voice answered. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "It's me. I need extraction." Rick watched her face carefully as she listened to the response. He saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her jaw clenched. "You know me, Marcus. You know I wouldn't be calling if this wasn't legitimate." She paused, listening. "The evidence is real. We can prove everything." Another pause, longer this time. "I understand the position this puts you in, but—" She stopped mid-sentence and Rick could hear the muffled voice on the other end getting louder. "Tasha, you're a fugitive now," Marcus said, his voice clear enough for Rick to hear. "The Bureau won't touch you." The words hung in the musty air between them. Rick saw something crack in Tasha's composed facade. Just for a second, before she locked it down again. "Marcus, people are dying. The corruption goes deeper than we thought. If you just—" "I'm sorry, Tasha, I really am, but I can't help you, not this time." The line went dead. Tasha stared at the phone for a long moment. Her last lifeline had just snapped. All her years of service, her dedication to justice, her spotless record, none of it mattered now. She was just another fugitive, running from a system she'd once sworn to uphold. With controlled fury, she slammed the phone shut. The sound echoed off the basement walls, disturbing years of settled dust. "If no one's coming to save us," she said, her voice hard with determination, "we'll do it ourselves." Rick watched her toss the now useless phone into a corner. He understood what it meant to lose faith in the system you'd dedicated your life to. He'd been living with that reality for years, numbing himself with alcohol and cynicism. But watching Tasha face that moment, seeing her choose to fight back instead of break, stirred something in him he thought had died long ago. The basement fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic above. Through the grimy windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, reminding them that another day was slipping away. They were alone now, truly alone against an entire corrupt system that wanted them dead. Tasha pulled out her laptop again, her movements precise and determined. The soft blue glow of the screen illuminated her face in the dimness of the basement. She wasn't giving up. She was just getting started. Rick checked his ammunition one more time, counting the bullets they had left. Not many, but maybe enough if they were smart about it. The weight of his badge in his pocket felt different now. Not a symbol of authority anymore, but a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The hunt for them continued, growing more desperate with each passing hour. Every cop in the city would be looking for them, every camera scanning for their faces, every informant listening for whispers of their location. But down here in this dusty basement, surrounded by forgotten books and broken dreams, 2 unlikely allies had found their resolve. They had no backup, no support, no safety net. Just the truth they'd uncovered and the determination to see it through. The abandoned hotel loomed over them like a crumbling giant, its broken windows staring down at Rick and Tasha like empty eyes. Inside, the lobby's faded grandeur only highlighted how far they'd fallen. Marble floors covered in dust, torn wallpaper hanging in strips, and the musty smell of decay everywhere. Rick pulled out the burner phone they'd grabbed earlier, turning it over in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he punched in Sloane's number. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Daniels." Rick kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end. Rick could almost see Sloane's face, that smug grin he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. "Well, well, the prodigal son returns." Sloane's voice dripped with fake warmth. "What's on your mind, partner?" Tasha watched Rick intently from across the room, her hand resting near her holstered weapon. She didn't trust this plan. Rick could see it in her eyes. But they were running out of options. "I want to make a deal," Rick said, pacing across the dusty floor. "This whole thing, it's gotten out of hand. I've got something you want. You've got something I need." "And what might that be?" "Information. The kind that could bury Monroe. And you along with him." Rick paused for effect. "Unless we can work something out?" Sloane chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Where? The docks. Pier 17, come alone, this stays between us. When? Rick checked his watch. 1 hour. And Sloan? Don't try anything stupid, I've got insurance. He hung up before Sloan could respond. Tasha shook her head, her expression grim. He won't come alone, she said. You know that, right? Rick nodded, checking his weapon. I'm counting on it. The sun was setting as they made their way to the docks, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden planks. The air smelled of salt and rotting fish, and somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded its mournful call. They found a spot behind a stack of shipping containers, giving them a clear view of Pier 17 while staying hidden in the growing darkness. Tasha crouched beside Rick, her eyes scanning the area. This feels wrong, she whispered. Too quiet. She was right. The usual sounds of dockwork had died away, leaving an unnatural stillness. No workers, no machinery, not even the usual seagulls fighting over scraps. Rick felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There, Tasha pointed to movement at the far end of the pier. A black SUV pulled up, followed by another, and another. Rick's stomach dropped as he watched the vehicles disgorge their occupants. SWAT team members in full tactical gear spilled out, taking up positions behind various pieces of cover. Sloan emerged from the lead vehicle, Kevlar vest visible under his jacket. Damn it, Rick muttered. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Tasha pulled him deeper into the shadows as more vehicles arrived. They're not here to negotiate. This is an execution squad. They watched as the SWAT team methodically began securing the area, their movements precise and practiced. Sloan stood in the center of it all, talking into a radio, probably coordinating with other units. They'll have the whole area surrounded soon, Rick said, his mind racing. We need to move. But as they turned to retreat, they heard the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel behind them. More SWAT teams were closing in from the rear. They knew we'd be watching, Tasha said, her voice tight. They're pushing us into a kill box. Rick looked around desperately. They were trapped between the water and an advancing wall of heavily armed officers. The shipping containers offered some cover, but it wouldn't last long against that kind of firepower. Sloan's voice boomed out over a megaphone. Come on out, Rick. Let's talk about that deal. Laughter echoed from the other officers. This wasn't law enforcement anymore. This was a hunting party. We can't keep running, Tasha said, checking her ammunition. Her eyes had taken on a steely determination. Every time we run, they're one step ahead. Every person we try to trust turns out to be on their payroll. Rick nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. They'd been playing defense since this whole thing started, reacting instead of acting, and it had nearly gotten them killed multiple times. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness around them, searching. They could hear radio chatter as the net tightened. Tasha pulled back the slide on her pistol, the click seeming impossibly loud in the tense silence. Her face was set with grim determination as she looked at Rick. Enough running, she said firmly. Let's finish this. The salt-tinged air whipped around them as Rick and Tasha crouched behind a stack of rusty shipping containers. The metal walls felt cold against Rick's back as he peered around the corner, watching Sloan direct his SWAT team with sharp hand signals. Their black tactical gear made them look like shadows moving through the dim evening light. Split up. Cover all exits. Sloan's voice echoed across the docks. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grew closer. Rick's heart pounded against his ribs. He'd been in shootouts before, but this was different. This time, he was the target. He glanced at Tasha, who remained eerily calm beside him, her eyes scanning their surroundings with practiced precision. We need an exit. Now. Rick's whisper was barely audible over the approaching footsteps. Tasha's gaze swept upward, catching sight of something in the fading light. She nudged Rick's arm and pointed to a rusted service ladder clinging to the side of an old warehouse about 30 yards away. Up there. Rick assessed the distance. They'd have to sprint across open ground to reach it. That's a lot of exposure. You got a better idea? Tasha's voice was tight but controlled. The sound of a radio crackled nearby. Team 2, move to the east side, box them in. Rick gripped his gun tighter. Ladies first. Tasha's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. On my mark. She waited, counting under her breath as footsteps approached from both directions. 3, 2, 1. Now. They burst from behind the container, running full tilt toward the ladder. The first shout went up almost immediately. There, by the warehouse. The air exploded with gunfire. Bullets pinged off metal containers and concrete, sending sparks flying. Rick felt the wind of a round pass too close to his head. He ducked lower, following Tasha's zigzagging path. "Keep moving," she yelled, never breaking stride. They reached the ladder just as another volley of shots rang out. Rick pushed Tasha ahead of him. "Go! Go!" She grabbed the rusty rungs and started climbing. Rick turned, firing 2 quick shots to keep the SWAT team's heads down, then followed. The old ladder creaked under their weight, swaying slightly with each movement. A bullet struck the metal just inches from Rick's hand. He could hear Sloan shouting below, "Don't let them reach the top!" Rick's arms burned as he climbed. The ladder seemed endless, each rung taking them further from the ground, but not quite far enough from danger. Finally, Tasha reached the roof's edge and pulled herself over. She turned immediately, extending her hand to Rick. He grabbed it just as another shot struck the ladder, making it shudder violently. With Tasha's help, he rolled onto the rooftop, breathing hard. But they couldn't rest. Tasha was already moving, leading them behind an old ventilation unit as more bullets sparked off the roof surface. She pulled out her last burner phone, their final lifeline. Rick kept watch while she dialed, his gun trained on the roof access door. It wouldn't take Sloan's team long to find their way up here. "I need an extraction now." Tasha's voice was clipped, professional, despite everything they'd just been through. She listened for a moment, her face tightening. "You're asking for a miracle, Tasha," came the tinny voice from the phone. "Then work fast." She ended the call just as the sound of boots on metal stairs echoed from somewhere below. Sloan's voice carried up through the night air, full of barely contained rage. "Fan out! They're not leaving here alive!" Rick checked his ammunition, half a magazine left. He looked at Tasha, who was shoving the phone back in her pocket. "Do we have backup?" She exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting his. "If we live long enough to see it." The roof access door burst open with a metallic bang. Rick and Tasha pressed themselves flat against the ventilation unit, weapons ready. The sound of tactical boots spreading across the rooftop told them they were quickly running out of options. Sloan's voice carried across the roof, closer now. "Building surrounded. There's nowhere left to run." Rick looked at Tasha, saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. But whatever came next would have to wait. For now, survival was all that mattered. The footsteps drew closer. In the distance, sirens wailed. The night was far from over. The city lights blurred past as Rick guided the stolen sedan down the highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every few seconds, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, searching for the flash of police lights. The engine hummed steadily beneath them, eating up the miles as they put distance between themselves and the docks. Tasha sat rigid in the passenger seat, her FBI credentials clutched in her hand. She hadn't said a word since they'd escaped, but Rick could practically hear her mind working, plotting their next move. Finally, she broke the silence. "We can't just run forever. We need to go after Monroe before he shuts us down permanently." Rick let out a harsh laugh. "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" They were fugitives, with every cop in the city hunting them. What could they possibly do? But when he glanced over, Tasha was smirking, holding up her FBI credentials. "We walk right through the front door." Rick's stomach dropped. "You want to what?" "The district attorney's office." Think about it. Monroe's been covering his tracks for years. There has to be a paper trail somewhere, and the DA's office would have copies of every case file, every complaint, every internal investigation that got buried. Rick weaved through traffic, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. Monroe was careful, but even he couldn't erase everything. "And you think we can just walk in there? With our faces plastered all over the news?" "My credentials are still active. The system won't flag them until someone manually revokes my access. And it's late. Skeleton crew only. We get in, get the files, get out. It was crazy. Suicidal even. But they were running out of options. Rick took the next exit, steering them toward downtown. The DA's office occupied the 5th floor of an aging government building, with security that was more show than substance. He'd been there enough times to know the layout, the blind spots in the cameras, the back entrance that the cleaning crew used. They parked the stolen car 3 blocks away, in a dim alley where it wouldn't draw attention. The night air was cool against their faces as they moved through the shadows, keeping to side streets and service alleys. The back entrance to the DA's office was exactly as Rick remembered. A heavy metal door with an electronic card reader, partially hidden behind a dumpster. Tasha pulled out her credentials, holding her breath as she swiped them through the reader. A moment passed. Rick's heart thundered in his chest. The light turned green. The lock clicked open. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a narrow service corridor. Emergency lights cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempts to move quietly. "Files will be in the records room," Rick whispered, leading the way. "3rd door on the left." The records room was a windowless space crammed with filing cabinets and shelves. The air smelled of dust and old paper. Tasha immediately went to work, her fingers flying over the keyboard of a computer terminal while Rick kept watch at the door. "Got something," she muttered after a few minutes. "Multiple complaints against Monroe, all mysteriously dropped. Internal affairs investigations that went nowhere. Court records that don't match police reports." She pulled a flash drive from her pocket and started downloading files. Rick's nerves jangled with every passing second. They were too exposed here, too vulnerable. "There's more," Tasha said, her voice tight with excitement. "Financial records. Monroe's been taking payments from shell companies linked to known crime families. And Sloan, he's been coordinating with drug dealers, setting up rival gangs for arrests while protecting their competitors." The evidence kept mounting. Years of corruption, carefully hidden but never completely erased. Names, dates, bank records, all painting a picture of systematic abuse of power. Tasha worked methodically, uploading everything to a secure cloud server she'd set up. Once this goes public, there's no putting it back in the box. The whole department will be under federal investigation. Rick watched the progress bar inch forward on the screen. Each percentage point felt like a nail in Monroe's coffin, and maybe in theirs too, if they didn't play this right. Finally, Tasha's finger hovered over the enter key. The moment this goes live, we become their worst nightmare. Rick stood behind her, watching as the progress bar filled up. "Then let's make sure we survive to see it." She pressed enter. The files began uploading to servers across the country, spreading like digital wildfire. There would be no stopping it now, no covering it up. The truth about Monroe, about the department, about all of it, was about to explode into the open. The abandoned warehouse loomed in the darkness, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night. Inside, Rick and Tasha had set up a makeshift command center in what used to be a foreman's office. The room smelled of dust and old metal, but it was secure and off the grid, exactly what they needed. Tasha methodically checked their weapons, laying them out on a weathered desk. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as she counted ammunition and tested each firearm. The soft click of metal on metal echoed through the empty space. Rick leaned against the wall watching her work. His badge felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of everything he'd lost, and maybe everything he stood to gain. The past few days had turned his world upside down, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally doing something right. "You ever think about what happens after this?" he asked, breaking the silence. The question had been nagging at him all day. Tasha didn't look up from her work, her hands steady as she loaded another magazine. "No after until we take them down." Her voice was firm, leaving no room for debate. Rick nodded, understanding. They couldn't afford to get ahead of themselves. Not now. Not when they were so close. The warehouse creaked around them, settling in the night air. Through a broken window, the city lights twinkled in the distance. Somewhere out there, Monroe was waiting, probably planning their deaths. Tasha finished with the weapons and pulled out a blueprint of Monroe's private compound. The paper crinkled as she spread it across the desk, weighing down the corners with spent shell casings. "Security cameras here, here, and here," she said, pointing to different spots on the map. "Guard rotation every 30 minutes, 2 men at the main gate, 4 patrolling the perimeter." Rick studied the layout. Monroe's compound was a fortress, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, protected by high walls and state-of-the-art security. Getting in wouldn't be easy. They drove to the compound in silence, parking their stolen car behind an abandoned gas station half a mile away. The night air was cool against their skin as they moved through the shadows, keeping low and staying out of sight. From their vantage point in the thick woods surrounding the compound, they could see the guards making their rounds. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the manicured lawn. Rick pulled out his binoculars, scanning the building. 3 floors. Monroe's office will be on the top. He always liked looking down on everyone. Tasha nodded, making notes in a small notebook. "Security looks heavier than usual. He's expecting us." "Good," Rick said, his voice hard. "Let him sweat." They watched the guard rotations for another hour, timing their movements, looking for patterns. Every detail mattered. One mistake would get them killed. Tasha pointed to a service entrance on the east side. "That's our way in. Security's lighter there, and the camera has a 3-second blind spot during rotation." Rick checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. In a few hours, they'd either be dead or Monroe would be in handcuffs. There was no middle ground anymore. He cocked his gun, the sound sharp in the quiet night. No more running. Tasha nodded, her eyes fixed on the compound. "Let's end this." The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. Everything they'd been through, the betrayals, the chases, the near-death escapes, it all led to this moment. Monroe's compound stood before them like a dark castle, its windows glowing with warm light, hiding the corruption within. Rick checked his ammunition one last time, feeling the familiar comfort of the weapon in his hands. He'd carried a gun for years as a cop, but this was different. This time, he wasn't just following orders. This time, he was choosing his own path. Tasha moved silently beside him, her movements fluid and practiced. She'd been training for moments like this her entire career, but Rick could see the tension in her shoulders. This wasn't just another operation for her. This was personal. The guards continued their patrols, unaware of the 2 figures watching from the darkness. In less than an hour, everything would change. The corrupt empire Monroe had built would come crashing down, one way or another. Rick glanced at Tasha, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. They didn't need words anymore. They both knew what had to be done. The city sprawled out behind them, a maze of lights and shadows where they'd played this deadly game of cat and mouse. But now, the game was ending. No more running. No more hiding. Monroe's compound waited before them, a final obstacle between justice and corruption. Whatever happened next would change everything. For them, for the department, for the entire city. Tasha checked her watch one last time, then gave Rick a slight nod. It was time. The moonless night cloaked Rick and Tasha as they approached Monroe's compound. Security lights cast harsh shadows across the manicured lawn, creating patches of darkness perfect for their approach. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps silent on the damp grass. Rick signaled to Tasha as the first guard rounded the corner. The man never saw them coming. Rick's arm wrapped around his throat in a sleeper hold while Tasha secured his weapons and radio. They dragged him behind a hedge, zip-tying his hands and feet. 2 more at the service entrance, Tasha whispered, checking her watch. The camera would rotate in exactly 30 seconds, giving them their window. They waited, muscles tense, breathing controlled. The camera turned. They moved. The guards at the door went down quickly. One from Tasha's precise strike to the throat, the other from Rick's swift takedown. No shots fired, no alarms raised. They were in. The interior of Monroe's compound reeked of wealth. Marble floors, expensive artwork, crystal chandeliers. Everything bought with dirty money and broken lives. Rick felt his anger rising as they crept through the halls, neutralizing guards with silent efficiency. They found the security room on the second floor, voices drifting through the heavy wooden door. Monroe's distinctive growl carried clearly. "They think they can take me down with some goddamn documents?" Tasha pulled out a small device, a remote-controlled circuit breaker she'd prepared earlier. She pressed the button. The compound plunged into darkness. Emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Rick and Tasha moved as one, bursting through the door, guns trained on Monroe and Sloan. The two corrupt officers spun around, reaching for their weapons. "No, but we can." Tasha's voice was ice-cold in the red-tinted darkness. Monroe's face contorted with rage, his hand hovering over his holster. Sloan looked between them, calculating his odds. "You really think you can walk in here and take me down?" Monroe sneered, his composure cracking. "I own this city. I own the courts. I own Dash." The first shot came from one of Monroe's hidden security guards, cutting through the air where Tasha's head had been a second before. She dove behind a desk as Rick took cover behind a filing cabinet. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions as Monroe's security team emerged from concealed positions. Bullets tore through computer monitors and shattered glass displays. Rick returned fire, taking down two guards with precise shots. Tasha's aim was equally deadly. Another guard fell, clutching his shoulder. Through the mayhem, Sloan saw his chance. He bolted for the back door, using the firefight as cover. "Go!" Tasha shouted over the gunfire, dropping another guard. "I'll handle Monroe. Get Sloan." Rick hesitated for a split second, meeting Tasha's eyes. In that brief moment, an entire conversation passed between them. Trust, determination, the promise to finish what they'd started. He nodded and sprinted after Sloan, leaving Tasha to face Monroe. The corrupt captain had taken cover behind an overturned table, barking orders into his radio. More guards would be coming. Tasha needed to end this quickly. She moved like a shadow through the red emergency lighting flanking Monroe's position. Her FBI training showed in every calculated step, every measured breath. Monroe fired blindly in her direction, his shots wild with panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be untouchable. Meanwhile, Rick chased Sloan through the compound's winding corridors. His former partner was fast, but Rick knew his tells. Which way he'd turn, where he'd try to lose his pursuit. Back in the security room, Tasha closed in on Monroe. The man who'd corrupted an entire police department, who'd ordered her death, who'd turned good cops into criminals, was finally cornered. She stepped out from behind a bullet-riddled desk, her gun trained steadily on Monroe's head. The emergency lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the fear breaking through his arrogant facade. "You destroyed lives to protect yourself," Tasha said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "Tonight, it ends." Monroe's lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes betrayed his terror. "Then pull the damn trigger." In the hallway, Rick's footsteps pounded against marble floors as he gained on Sloan. His former partner crashed through the back exit, and Rick followed, determination driving every step. The night had started with a silent infiltration. Now, with bullets flying and lives in the balance, everything hung on these next few moments. In one room, Tasha faced down the architect of corruption. In another, Rick pursued the man who'd helped enforce it. Years of injustice, of covered-up crimes and falsified evidence had led to this confrontation. The compound's red emergency lights pulsed like a heartbeat, marking every second of this final showdown. The alley behind Monroe's compound was a maze of shadows and steam rising from metal grates. Rick's boots pounded against wet pavement as he chased Sloan, his lungs burning with each breath. The corrupt officer was fast, but Rick was faster, driven by years of pent-up rage and guilt. With a final burst of speed, Rick launched himself forward, tackling Sloan to the ground. They crashed hard onto the rough asphalt, rolling through puddles. Sloan's elbow caught Rick in the ribs, but Rick held on, refusing to let his former partner escape. They scrambled to their feet, circling each other like wolves. Sloan's face was twisted with hatred, his usually neat uniform now soaked and muddy. "You should have taken the money and walked, Daniels," he sneered, spitting blood from a split lip. Rick's hands clenched into fists, his shoulder muscles coiled tight. "Maybe, But for once, I'm doing the right thing. The words felt strange in his mouth. Honest, clean, like washing away years of dirt. Sloane's hand moved like lightning, pulling his backup piece from his ankle holster. The gun gleamed dully in the dim light. Rick saw the barrel rise, saw Sloane's finger tighten on the trigger, but he was a fraction too slow. Bang! The sound echoed off the alley walls like thunder. White-hot pain exploded through Rick's shoulder, spinning him backward. He stumbled, his hand clutching at the wound as warm blood seeped between his fingers. Through the haze of pain, he saw Sloane advancing, gun still raised, a cruel smile spreading across his face. This was it. After everything, the corruption, the awakening of his conscience, the fight to make things right, he was going to die in a dirty alley at the hands of a dirty cop. Then another shot cracked through the night. Sloane's eyes went wide with surprise. His gun clattered to the ground as he looked down at his chest, where a dark stain was rapidly spreading. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His knees buckled and he collapsed face first onto the wet pavement. Rick looked up through the rain to see Tasha on the rooftop, her gun still trained on Sloane's motionless form. She'd saved his life. Again. The world started to spin as the adrenaline faded and the pain intensified. Rick slumped against the alley wall, leaving a smear of blood on the brick. He heard rapid footsteps as Tasha rushed down the fire escape and ran to his side. Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she pressed against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Her face swam in and out of focus above him, but he could see the concern in her eyes. "You still with me?" Despite the pain, or maybe because of it, Rick found himself grinning. Not a coward anymore, huh? The words came out weaker than he'd intended, but they made Tasha smirk anyway. "Not today," she replied, keeping pressure on his shoulder while pulling out her phone with her free hand. Her voice was steady, but Rick could hear the undertone of worry. The pain was getting worse, spreading like fire through his chest. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He tried to focus on Tasha's face, on the determination in her eyes, but consciousness was slipping away like water through his fingers. The last thing he heard was Tasha shouting for help, her voice echoing off the alley walls. Then darkness claimed him, and the screen faded to black. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood and the evidence of their final confrontation. Sloane's body lay still in a growing puddle, while Tasha held Rick's unconscious form, waiting for the sound of approaching sirens. The night had changed everything. There was no going back now. The alley behind Monroe's compound faded into a blur of dark shapes and neon signs as Tasha sped through the city streets. Rick drifted in and out of consciousness in the passenger seat, his shoulder burning with white-hot pain. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining the fabric a deep crimson. "Stay with me, Daniels," Tasha ordered, her voice tight as she took a sharp turn. The tires screeched against wet pavement. "You don't get to check out now." Rick's head lolled against the window. Everything felt distant and fuzzy, like he was underwater. "Where?" He managed to groan, his tongue thick in his mouth. "You're not dying in a back alley," Tasha muttered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I need you alive." The car jerked to a stop in front of a private hospital's emergency entrance. The sudden movement sent a fresh wave of agony through Rick's shoulder, making him gasp. Through half-closed eyes, he watched Tasha sprint around to his door and yank it open. "Come on," she grunted, pulling his good arm over her shoulder. "Work with me here." Rick stumbled alongside her, his feet barely cooperating. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a blast of cold air-conditioned air. The fluorescent lights made him squint. "FBI!" Tasha's voice rang out across the quiet ER waiting room. She flashed her badge at the startled staff, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This man needs immediate treatment. No calls to the police, do you understand?" A young doctor stepped forward, his eyes widening at the sight of Rick's blood-soaked shirt. "Get me a gurney," he shouted to the nurses. "GSW to the shoulder. Significant blood loss." The world tilted sideways as Rick was lifted onto the gurney. The ceiling lights blurred into streaks as they rushed him down a hallway. Voices echoed around him, medical terms mixing with urgent commands. BP's dropping. Start an IV. Type and cross. Rick felt a sharp prick in his arm, then blessed darkness claimed him. When consciousness returned, it came slowly. First, there was the steady beeping of monitors, then the antiseptic smell of hospital cleaner. Finally, Rick managed to open his heavy eyelids. He was in a private room, early morning light filtering through Venetian blinds. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, and an IV dripped clear fluid into his arm. When he tried to shift position, something clinked. Looking down, he saw his right wrist handcuffed to the bed rail. 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside his door, their backs straight, faces stern. Through the window, he could see their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Welcome back." Rick turned his head. Tasha sat in a chair beside his bed, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked tired but composed, her FBI badge now prominently displayed on her belt. "You did good, Daniels," she said quietly. "But this is where the road ends for you." Rick tested the handcuff, feeling the cold metal bite into his skin. "How long was I out?" "About an hour and a half. The bullet went clean through. You got lucky." Tasha leaned forward, her expression serious. "The doctor says you'll make a full recovery, just in time for your court date." Rick let his head fall back against the pillow, staring up at the speckled ceiling tiles. A hollow laugh escaped his throat. "Guess I always knew I wasn't walking away from this clean." Tasha stood up, smoothing her jacket. "No," she agreed, "but you're walking away a better man." She turned and walked toward the door. The officers straightened as she approached, stepping aside to let her pass. Rick watched her go, feeling the weight of his choices settle over him like a heavy blanket. The officers entered his room, their faces professionally blank. One began reading him his rights while the other checked his handcuff. Rick barely heard the familiar words. His mind was on everything that had led him here. All the compromises, the looked-away moments, the slow erosion of his moral compass. And finally, the choice to do the right thing, even knowing it would cost him everything. Through the window, he caught a final glimpse of Tasha's retreating form. She didn't look back. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of FBI headquarters as cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position. Tasha Owens stood at the podium, her navy suit crisp and professional, her posture straight and confident. The room buzzed with excitement. This was the biggest police corruption scandal the city had seen in decades. "Good morning," Tasha began, her voice clear and steady. "Today marks the end of a systematic abuse of power that has plagued our city's police department for years. Thanks to extensive investigation and evidence gathering, we can now confirm that multiple high-ranking officers, including Captain James Monroe, were involved in a complex criminal enterprise operating within District 17. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Captain Monroe was led through a side door, his hands cuffed behind his back. His usually immaculate uniform was wrinkled, his face twisted into a snarl of hatred as he caught Tasha's eye. 2 FBI agents gripped his arms firmly, guiding him past the crowd of reporters who thrust microphones in his direction. "Captain Monroe, did you orchestrate the corruption ring? How many officers were involved? What about the falsified arrests?" Monroe kept his mouth shut, but his eyes burned with rage as he was escorted through the press room. On the mounted TV screens around the room, news anchors were already breaking down the story. In a shocking development this morning, federal authorities have uncovered what appears to be one of the largest police corruption scandals in recent history, a CNN anchor reported. Documents reveal systematic evidence planting, false arrests, and connections to organized crime, all orchestrated by senior officers within District 17. Tasha continued her statement, laying out the basics of what they'd uncovered. The evidence shows a pattern of illegal activities including evidence tampering, extortion, and collaboration with criminal enterprises. Multiple officers have been taken into custody, and we expect more arrests to follow as our investigation continues. She could see the shock on the reporters' faces as she detailed the scope of the corruption. Video footage played on the screens behind her, surveillance clips showing officers planting evidence, making illegal deals, threatening witnesses. Each piece of evidence had been carefully compiled and verified before this moment. 2 hours later, Tasha stood in her temporary office at FBI headquarters, watching live coverage of the fallout. Police cruisers with lights flashing surrounded District 17. FBI agents led officers out in handcuffs, faces she recognized, people who had been part of Monroe's inner circle. The corruption had run deeper than even she had initially suspected. Her phone vibrated on the desk. Restricted number flashed on the screen. She answered, already knowing who it would be. "You did it, Owens." Agent Marcus Hale's familiar voice came through. The same voice that had refused to help her when she'd been on the run. But she understood. He'd had to maintain his cover, protect his position so he could help when the moment was right. "The Bureau wants you back," he continued. "Your reinstatement paperwork is already being processed. You'll be cleared of all charges by the end of the day." Tasha closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. After everything, the undercover work, being framed, running for her life, it was finally over. Justice had been served. "Thank you, Marcus," she said simply. "Don't thank me," he replied. "You did this. Against all odds, you brought down an entire corrupt precinct. The director himself wants to meet with you next week." On the TV screen, another officer was being led out of District 17 in handcuffs. The ticker at the bottom showed updated numbers. 23 officers arrested so far, with more expected. Years of corruption and abuse of power were finally being exposed to the light. Reporters crowded around the precinct entrance, their questions overlapping. How high up does this corruption go? Were any other precincts involved? What about the victims of false arrests? Tasha watched as Monroe's car pulled away from the FBI building, headed for federal detention. His empire had crumbled, his years of manipulation and corruption laid bare for everyone to see. The man who had ordered her death was now facing decades behind bars. She turned to the window, looking out over the city. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, but the air felt clearer somehow, like a toxic cloud had finally lifted. On her desk, files were stacked neatly, hundreds of cases that would need to be reviewed, false convictions that would need to be overturned. The work wasn't over, but the hardest part was done. The TV continued its coverage. In what authorities are calling a systematic dismantling of justice, evidence suggests that Captain James Monroe and his associates had been operating this corruption ring for over a decade. Sources say the investigation was spearheaded by FBI agent Tasha Owens, who worked undercover within the department. Tasha picked up a file from her desk, the first of many cases that would need to be re-examined. Justice had been served to the corrupt officers, but there were still countless victims who needed their names cleared. She had more work to do. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail's holding cell, casting harsh shadows across Rick Daniels' face. He sat on the cold metal bench, his shoulder throbbing beneath the simple white sling. His police uniform was long gone, replaced by standard-issue orange coveralls that scratched against his skin. The cell was small, just 8 by 10 feet, with a metal toilet in the corner and graffiti scratched into the concrete walls. He heard footsteps approaching, the distinct click of heels against the linoleum floor. The cell door creaked open, and Tasha Owens stepped inside. She wore her FBI badge on her hip, her navy suit perfectly pressed. Her expression was neutral, professional, but her eyes held a hint of something softer. "You're looking at 5 years," she said without preamble. "Maybe less if you cooperate." Her voice echoed slightly in the confined space. Rick nodded slowly, his good hand resting on his knee. "I deserve it." The words came easily, without the bitterness or anger that might have colored them just months ago. Tasha studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly. "A year ago, you wouldn't have said that." There was a note of curiosity in her voice, maybe even respect. "A year ago, I was a different man." Rick met her gaze steadily. The man who had framed her in that cafe seemed like a stranger now, someone operating on autopilot, following orders without questioning the cost. Tasha pulled up the single metal chair in the cell, its legs scraping against the concrete floor. She sat down, maintaining eye level with Rick. The DA wants your full testimony. Everything you know about Monroe's operation, every dirty cop, every false arrest. They'll get it, Rick said. All of it, no holds barred. The morning light filtered through the small window high up in the cell, casting a square of sunlight on the floor between them. Outside, they could hear the regular sounds of the jail, doors closing, officers calling out, the shuffle of feet in the corridor. You know, Tasha said, leaning forward slightly, when you planted that cocaine in my pocket, I saw something in your eyes. Doubt, like some part of you knew it was wrong but couldn't stop yourself. Rick rubbed his face with his good hand. I'd gotten so used to following orders I forgot how to think for myself. Forgot what it meant to be a real cop. 3 hours later, Rick stood in the courtroom, his orange jumpsuit stark against the rich wooden panels of the walls. The room was packed. Journalists, other officers, families of those affected by the corruption. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, but the air still felt thick with tension. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, looked down from her bench. Rick had already entered his guilty plea, and his lawyer had presented his cooperation agreement with the FBI. Hours of recorded testimony about Monroe's operation, detailed accounts of corruption that went back years. Officer Rick Daniels, the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. While your cooperation with federal authorities has been noted and considered, the gravity of your actions cannot be ignored. You betrayed the trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. You participated in a system that destroyed lives and undermined the very principles of justice you swore to uphold. Rick stood straight despite the pain in his shoulder, accepting each word as it came. However, the judge continued, your testimony has been instrumental in bringing to light a corruption scandal that might otherwise have remained hidden. Your willingness to accept responsibility and assist in dismantling this criminal enterprise has been taken into consideration. The scratch of pens on paper filled the brief silence as reporters took notes. In the gallery, Rick could see Tasha sitting in the back row, her expression unreadable. Officer Rick Daniels, you are sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs ready. As they clicked around Rick's wrists, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. The weight of lies and corruption that had pressed down on him for years seemed to lift slightly. Tasha caught his eye as he was led toward the door. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction at seeing him in cuffs. Instead, there was something like understanding, maybe even respect. She gave him a small nod, which he returned. The bailiff guided him through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Camera flashes erupted from the hallway as reporters called out questions. But Rick kept his head high as he walked past them. For the first time in years, despite the handcuffs and the sentence ahead of him, he felt truly free. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, warming his face as he walked down the corridor. Each step took him further from the man he had been, and closer to the man he wanted to become. 3 years was a long time, but it was also a chance to make things right, to remember what justice really meant. 1 month later, Rick Daniels steps into his modest apartment, setting down groceries as he notices an envelope under his door. Inside, his private investigator license approval letter marks the start of a new chapter. He's no longer a cop, but he can still seek justice on his own terms. His phone buzzes, a text from Tasha. Got the license? He smirks, replying, just came in. Across town, Tasha stands in the FBI office, reinstated and leading critical cases, her reputation stronger than ever. Their paths have diverged, but justice still binds them. 6 months later, Rick stands beneath a neon-lit diner sign tracking a missing teen, his latest case. Across the street, Tasha steps out of the shadows, working a federal human trafficking case. Their cases overlap. The girl Rick is searching for is one of Tasha's possible victims. For a moment, history lingers between them. The chase, the betrayals, the redemption. But now they stand as equals, both fighting for justice. Looks like we're in the same business now, Rick smirks. Tasha nods, a rare smile playing at her lips. Better make sure you do it right this time. If you enjoyed the story of Tasha, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.